In the icy mists of Midgard, where the winds howled like hungry wolves and the sun rarely dared pierce the gray sky, rose the legend of Ragnar Völundar, the Jarl of Shadows. He was no ordinary man, for in his veins ran a volatile mixture of insatiable ambition and a courage bordering on recklessness. His eyes, as dark as the depths of a bottomless fjord, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 winters and the brilliance of 100 battles. His land, Fjordheim, nestled between craggy peaks that scraped the clouds and a treacherous sea, was a kingdom of warriors forged in the fires of adversity and the icy waters. Every man, every woman, carried within them the essence of the struggle for survival, honoring the gods with blood and steel every dawn. But Ragnar, oh, Ragnar was different. He watched the gods, the Aesir venerated in mead halls and daring sacrifices, with a gaze that mingled reverence and deep questioning. He saw the glory of Thor, the wisdom of Odin, the elusive beauty of Freya. But in his heart simmered the conviction that fate, that invisible thread woven by the Norns, could be torn, rewritten by stronger hands, by more indomitable wills. The sea, often stormy, reflected the turbulence in his soul. Each wave that crashed against the rocks of Fjordheim seemed to whisper stories of indifferent gods, of a distant pantheon that dictated the rules of a world Ragnar felt he could shape for himself. The villages along the coast lived in the shadow of his deeds, terrified by his audacious raids and inspired by his unwavering bravery. In times of peace, he was the fierce protector of his people. In times of war, the storm that swept away his enemies. The fame of Ragnar Völundar, the Jarl of Shadows, spread across the 9 worlds like a wildfire, carried by the breath of the wind and the murmur of travelers. It wasn't just his prowess. In battle, that was legendary. They said he could fight 10 men single-handedly and emerge unscathed, that his axe, Frost's fury, sang a song of death with every blow. It was the aura of mystery that enveloped him, the way he seemed to walk the borders between the world of men and the divine realms. They said he negotiated with the shadows themselves, that on nights of the new moon, his eyes glowed with an inhuman light. His enemies feared him, not only for the strength of his arms, but for the unpredictability of his tactics, the audacity of his plans that often defied logic and the laws of war. He led his warriors with a ferocity that inspired unconditional loyalty, transforming ordinary men into war machines driven by blind faith in their leader. The women of Fjordheim regarded him with an admiration bordering on reverential awe, not only for the strength he exuded, but for the melancholy that sometimes haunted his gaze, as if he carried a burden no other mortal could comprehend. In their taverns, songs recounted his exploits, but also whispered questions about his true nature. Was he a gift from the gods, or an anomaly born of the cold, unforgiving earth? The Norse lands, once a mosaic of independent kingdoms and warring tribes, began to feel the weight of a growing threat that came not from an external enemy, but from within the very heart of mythology. A subtle but profound discontent began to creep into the hearts of the most daring, and Ragnar Völundar, the Jarl of Shadows, was at the epicenter of this dissatisfaction. He saw a pantheon of distant gods caught up in their own intrigues and glories, oblivious to the suffering and aspirations of the mortals they so adored in times of need. He believed that honor lay not merely in serving the gods, but in forging one's own destiny with steady hands and a brave heart, even if it meant treading forbidden paths, defying the laws that governed the cosmos. within him, a silent conflict grew. Loyalty to the ancient customs and gods that shaped his culture, and the hunger for power that would allow him to rewrite the rules, to protect his people, not by divine mercy, but by his own strength and cunning. This duality had made him predictable, a leader admired and feared in equal measure. His strength lay in his ability to inspire, to unite warriors under his banner in pursuit of glory and autonomy. His weakness, however, was the shadow of arrogance that loomed over him, the belief that no power, divine or mortal, was superior to his own unbreakable will. The Arctic winds brought with them more than biting cold and relentless snow. They brought whispers of ancient prophecies and omens of a seismic shift that would shake the 9 worlds to their foundations. Ragnar Völundar, sitting in his stone hall in Fjordheim, the fire crackling in the hearths as the storm raged outside, felt the weight of these changes on his tormented soul. He looked at his warriors, men hardened by life in the frozen lands, whose faces, scarred by battle and time, reflected the harshness of their existence. They followed him blindly, willing to die for him in any endeavor, no matter how mad it seemed. But Ragnar sought more than the fleeting glory of battle. He yearned for control over the fate that the gods of Asgard seemed to hold with an iron fist, often indifferent to the prayers and suffering of mortals. In his mind, the veneration of the Aesir sounded like a song of resignation, a passive acceptance of a divine plan he saw as flawed and at times cruel. Betrayal, in his view, was not an act of treachery against the divine, but an act of courage, a cry for independence against an oppressive power. The fjords, winding like blue veins through the desolate landscape, were the stage for his brutal and magnificent existence. There, Ragnar had learned to navigate the treacherous waters, to fight the storms that threatened to engulf his drakars, to hunt the beasts that inhabited the dark forests. Every bend, every hidden rock, every treacherous current was familiar to him, as were the hearts of his men. He understood them, their ambitions, their fears, their thirst for recognition and wealth, and he knew how to use this, how to ignite the flame of glory in their eyes and send them into the most perilous battles, knowing they would return victorious or fall with honor. But this relentless quest for control, for power, pushed him beyond the limits of the known world, into domains where mortals should not dare tread. A nagging and persistent question haunted his thoughts through long nights. What if the gods were not as powerful as they were said? What if the force that truly moved the universe was accessible, waiting for a mortal bold enough to claim it? It was in this landscape of savage beauty, yet a constant danger, that Ragnar Völundar forged his legend. A legend that would soon place him on a direct collision course with the very architects of fate. He was not just a Jarl, a tribal leader. He was a challenge to the established order, a questioning of the divine authority that underpinned the very fabric of Midgard. His story, beginning to unfold in the mists and ice, promised to be an epic of courage, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of a power that transcended mortality. A tale that would echo through the centuries, reminding all that even shadows can harbor the brightest light, and that the heart of a man, when driven by an indomitable will, can dare to defy even the gods. The journey of Ragnar Völundar, the Jarl of Shadows, to defy Odin and betray the gods was only just beginning. And the icy winds of Asgard were already beginning to sense the approach of an unprecedented storm. He watched the stars for answers, but found only echoes of his own ambition, reflected in the vast, indifferent cosmos. Ragnar's disdain for Asgard was no mere whim. It was a visceral reaction to the perceived divine ineffectiveness in dealing with the stark realities of Midgard. He saw the gods as distant figures, preoccupied with their own squabbles and glories, but incapable of offering real refuge from the famine, disease, and brutality that ravaged his people. The land, with its relentless winters and fleeting summers, demanded pragmatism, not empty prayers. Every lost harvest, every life claimed by an epidemic, every incursion of rival tribes that the gods failed to prevent, fueled Ragnar's conviction that salvation lay in human strength, intelligence, and audacity. So he sought knowledge in darker sources, in ancient whispers that spoke of latent powers within the very depths of the world, of ancient magics that emanated not from divine good pleasure, but from the raw power of nature and indomitable will. It was in this context of necessity and resentment that the idea of betraying the gods ceased to be an unthinkable thought and became a calculated plan, a strategy to ensure the survival and prosperity of Fjordheim, even if it condemned it in the eyes of the Pantheon. Ragnar Völundar's forge didn't just produce weapons, it forged an alternative destiny for his people. While his smiths hammered the red-hot steel, shaping blades capable of slicing through armor and bone, Ragnar devoted himself to a more subtle but equally lethal art, manipulating loyalties and exploiting his opponent's weaknesses. He understood that true power lay not in brute force alone, but in the ability to sow discord, to offer a more advantageous path to those who felt forgotten or oppressed. His mastery of the arts of persuasion was as sharp as the edge of his axe. He had learned to read the hidden intentions in men's eyes, to identify their repressed ambitions, and to exploit their deepest fears. This skill, combined with his own physical strength and tactical genius, made him a formidable leader, capable of inspiring unwavering devotion in his followers and instilling paralyzing terror in his enemies. The land itself seemed to conspire with him, the winds carrying his persuasive words away, the shadows of its forests hiding his movements and plans. This new phase in Ragnar's life was marked by a relentless search for forbidden artifacts and knowledge. He traveled far from Fjordheim to remote places where legends whispered of ancient magic and forgotten powers. He explored dark caves where the spirits of the earth were said to manifest, consulted oracles who spoke in riddles and omens, and even ventured into realms where the boundaries between life and death were tenuous. Each discovery, no matter how small, fueled his ambition and strengthened his conviction that the gods of Asgard did not hold a monopoly on power. He learned of rituals that invoked the primordial forces of nature, of enchantments that could influence men's minds, and even of the possibility of bargaining with entities outside the known pantheon. This often lonely and dangerous journey of learning molded him into an even more formidable leader, a man who understood the complexity of power in its many forms and was willing to pay any price to obtain it. With each step, he moved further away from blind veneration and closer to an autonomous path, where his own will would be the only law governing him. In contrast to the passive veneration many accorded the gods, Ragnar cultivated a ruthless pragmatism. For him, efficacy was the measure of all things. If prayers failed to bring rain to the parched lands, he would seek more direct methods. If rituals failed to cure the illnesses that decimated his people, he would explore herbal knowledge and healing methods imparted by folk wisdom. This approach put him in direct conflict with religious orthodoxy, which saw such pursuits as disrespectful of divine power. However, Ragnar argued that true honor lay not in blind submission, but in the active responsibility to protect and provide for one's people. He saw the gods as distant figures, basking in their heavenly glories, while mortals struggled and suffered on earth. His decision to deviate from traditional doctrine was not an act of gratuitous rebellion, but a necessity imposed by the raw circumstances of his existence. A search for autonomy in a world that seemed dictated by uncontrollable and often indifferent forces. The weight of this new philosophy fell heavily on Ragnar's shoulders, transforming him into a symbol of hope for some and imminent danger for others. He now saw himself not just as a leader, but as an agent of change, someone who dared to question the status quo and forge a new path. His thirst for power was not just for personal power, but for the ability to shape the destiny of his people, freeing them from dependence on gods who, in his view, failed in their responsibilities. His confidence in his own capabilities grew with each passing day, fueled by the experiences and knowledge gained on his journeys. He was ready to go further, to challenge the very foundations of the world he knew, driven by a growing certainty that the future belonged to those who dared to dream and act, even if it meant walking in the deepest shadows. Now consider how this relentless determination manifested itself when faced with the temptation of an even greater power, one that promised transcendence but demanded a sacrifice of cosmic proportions. The seed of discord planted by Ragnar Völundar was germinating not only in Fjordheim, but in the most remote corners of Midgard, touching the hearts of warriors and peasants who felt abandoned by divine promises. He realized that the gods, in their ethereal majesty, operated under a set of moral laws and power that no longer resonated with the harsh realities of mortal existence. The idea of betrayal to the gods for Ragnar was a reframing of perspective, not an act of disloyalty, but of self-sufficiency, a declaration of independence against a system that offered little concrete protection in exchange for absolute devotion. He began to explore the influence of elemental forces, not as divine manifestations, but as raw, malleable energies, accessible to those with the will and knowledge to channel them. Wind, fire, earth, and water became his potential allies, sources of power, independent of the whims of Asgard. With each dawn, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, not only to protect his people, but to forge a new paradigm, one where human strength and cunning were the measure of his own divinity. The core of Ragnar's philosophy lay in the belief that fate was not an immutable decree, but a constantly evolving fabric whose threads could be manipulated by those with the necessary courage and intelligence. He began searching ancient texts, forgotten runes, and ancient wisdom for methods of influencing fate and the course of events, unrelated to the direct intervention of the gods. Rather than turning to Odin for wisdom, Ragnar delved into tales of giants and primordial entities who held deeper knowledge of the structure of the cosmos. He saw that blind veneration, while comforting to many, imprisoned the mind and limited human potential. His quest, therefore, was for radical autonomy, where power was not granted but earned, and where the reward was the freedom to determine one's own path, without the interference of celestial beings. Now consider how this mindset led him to explore practices that, for many, were considered profane. Ragnar's exploration took him to regions where the gods' influence seemed more tenuous and where ancient traditions, predating the rise of Asgard, still held a latent power. He searched hidden valleys and inhospitable peaks where the whispers of shamans and prophetesses revealed secrets about the workings of the universe, not through a divine lens, but through an understanding of the energies that permeated existence itself. He realized that the gods, in their eternal grandeur, might have overlooked certain aspects of power, those that resided deep within the earth, in the murmurs of the primordial wind, or in forgotten shadows. His approach was not one of blasphemy, but of sharp pragmatism. If the gods offered no effective solutions to Midgard's adversities, then he would find his own, drawn from the oldest and most powerful sources in the cosmos. This phase of his journey took him further away from the traditional paths, paving the way for an inevitable confrontation with the forces he set out to overcome. Meanwhile, Ragnar developed a nuanced understanding of honor, separating it from servitude to the gods. He believed that true honor lay in the ability to protect one's people, to provide security and prosperity, even if this meant defying established conventions. In his view, a leader who blindly bowed to divine will, even in the face of his people's suffering, was dishonored to his core. Thus his journey became an act of courage in defending his autonomy and that of his people, seeking in alternative sources of power the strength necessary to resist the adversities that Asgard seemed to ignore. He began to see divine pacts and promises as chains that limited human potential, and his search for knowledge in lands not sanctioned by the gods was an attempt to break these chains. Ragnar's audacity manifested itself in his search for hidden knowledge that the gods themselves might have tried to suppress. He saw this not as an act of rebellion, but as humanity's innate right to understand and manipulate the forces that governed their world. In his travels, he encountered traces of ancient civilizations that had learned to access primordial power, to work with the energies that predated the very creation of the gods. Ragnar's goal was to reintegrate this forgotten knowledge into his own reality, believing that such wisdom could offer his people the strength and resilience needed to thrive in a world where the gods were not always reliable providers. He began to question the very nature of power, realizing that it was not a divine monopoly, but a force inherent in the universe, available to those who dared to seek it. The path Ragnar walked was solitary, but filled with a purpose that transcended mere personal ambition. He was forging a new philosophy, one that prioritized self-reliance and direct action over blind faith and hope in celestial intervention. His quest for forbidden knowledge was, in his mind, an act of empowerment for all humanity. He saw himself as a herald of a new age, where mortals would cease to be mere pawns in the gods' game and take control of their own destinies. It was a dangerous vision, for it challenged the very fabric of the cosmos. But Ragnar Völundar was increasingly convinced that it was the only way to ensure the survival and glory of his people in an unforgiving world. Now consider how this new understanding of power and autonomy propelled him into direct confrontation with the laws that governed the divine realms. In his quest to dismantle the order established by the gods, Ragnar Völundar was not content to simply question the authority of Asgard. He actively sought to unravel the very mechanics of power that kept the realms in balance. He realized that worship, as practiced by his people, was a one-way flow of energy, with humanity offering praise and sacrifices in exchange for a vague promise of protection and a place in Valhalla. Ragnar, however, envisioned a more dynamic exchange, where the energy emanating from mortals could be redirected, transformed, and utilized for more tangible and immediate purposes. He began to study the ancient arts of energy channeling, not only the familiar runic magic, but also the energetic flows inherent in the natural elements and the very bowels of Midgard. His dark eyes, once fixed on the sky for divine signs, now scanned the land, studying the patterns of Earth's currents and the cycles of wildlife, seeking to understand the energy that pulsed through everything, regardless of the Aesir's approval, the lifeblood of a towering mountain, the pent-up fury of a gathering storm, the subtle resilience of a plant sprouting from frozen ground. All these were, to Ragnar, a source of raw power, waiting to be grasped and harnessed. Delving deeper into his new understanding, Ragnar began experimenting with rituals aimed not at pleasing the gods, but rather at drawing and condensing environmental energy. He observed that places of great natural power, the highest peaks, the deepest caves, the confluences of sacred rivers, possessed a unique vibration, an echo of primordial forces. Rather than simply honoring these sites with offerings, Ragnar began creating stone formations and tracing complex symbols that, according to his studies, amplified and focused these energies. He realized that certain combinations of elements and intentions could create energetic vortices that, if channeled correctly, could be used for a variety of purposes, from strengthening the health of his warriors to subtly influencing the tides and winds on his seafaring forays. This was a form of magic intrinsically linked to the earth, a force that the gods, in their transcendence, perhaps no longer understood or directly controlled. It was a claim to the power that belonged to Midgard, and by extension, to its inhabitants. This new perspective led him to reevaluate the very nature of sacrifice. Rather than offering the best of his cattle or the most valiant of his warriors as tribute, Ragnar began to view sacrifice as an act of energetic exchange. He saw that life itself, in its ceaseless cycle of birth, life, and death, released immense amounts of energy. Rather than simply handing it over to the gods, he sought ways to retain and utilize this energy. He studied methods of conserving life force, not for himself, but to apply it more effectively for the benefit of Fjordheim. This led him to explore techniques that involved harmonizing with the natural cycles of renewal and decay, learning to draw out the latent power in seemingly destructive processes. For example, he observed how decaying wood in an ancient forest still pulsed with residual energy, and how the bones of hunted animals, once returned to the earth, nourished new life, releasing energy in the process. Ragnar sought to capture this energy in its purest state, before it completely dissipated into the cosmic cycle. Furthermore, Ragnar came to understand that true loyalty, not only from his men but from the elements themselves, was not achieved through imposition, but through understanding and mutual respect. He observed that game animals seemed more likely to offer themselves to those who demonstrated a deep knowledge of their territories and a respect for their life cycles. Likewise, he began to believe that the winds and tides, far from being mere natural whims, responded to a form of subtle communication, a language of intention and energy. He devoted hours to meditation in remote locations, trying to attune his own energy to that of the surrounding environment. It was not about commanding nature, but about becoming a part of it, inspiring trust in the forces he wished to harness. This process, he discovered, was more effective and sustainable than any form of coercion or supplication. True domination came from integration, not subjugation. Consequently, Ragnar began to develop a unique set of practices that combined ancient knowledge of runes with the manipulation of elemental energies. He no longer carved runes into his axes merely for luck in battle, but to channel the fury of thunder or the biting coldness of ice directly into their blades. His armor was imbued not only with protective enchantments, but with the strength of stone and the malleability of metal in their purest form. He saw himself not as an enemy of the gods, but as someone rediscovering the primordial sources of power that existed even before Asgard was built, a path that promised unprecedented autonomy for his people. Now consider how this new understanding of power and autonomy propelled him into direct confrontation with the laws that governed the divine realms. As the mists surrounding Ragnar Völundar's rise and conflicts begin to dissipate, an intricate pattern reveals itself, weaving the threads of his journey into a tapestry of deeper meaning. The epic battles and daring raids, though crucial milestones, were merely the foundation for an internal transformation, a metamorphosis in the very conception of power and authority. Disillusionment with the celestial realms, once a murmur of discontent, has solidified into an unshakable conviction, driven by the discovery that the life force that animates existence does not reside exclusively in the divine pantheons, but pulses within the very depths of the world, awaiting the hand that awakens it. Reflecting on this journey thus far, we realize how the quest for autonomy and the refusal to accept fate as an immutable decree have intertwined. Ancestral wisdom, once a distant echo, has become a practical guide, revealing ways to channel primordial energies and forge a destiny shaped by will and action. The laws of nature, seen by many as divine whims, have come to be understood as an intricate system of interconnected forces, accessible through understanding and attunement, not merely through supplication or imposition. At this point of convergence, the narrative invites us to contemplate the essence of the challenge Ragnar Völundar embodied. It was not simply a revolt against the gods, but a radical redefinition of what it means to be an agent in one's own universe. The lessons learned from his trials and triumphs echo as a call to introspection, suggesting that the limits we perceive are often merely self-imposed barriers, and that true strength lies in the courage to question, explore, and ultimately shape one's own reality. The reverberation of his choices resonates within us, inviting us to ponder the legacy of boldness and the relentless pursuit of a power that transcends mere permission. And so, in the icy wastes where the story of Ragnar Völundar, the Jarl of Shadows, unfolded like an epic saga, we find not only the echo of battles and the fury of an indomitable spirit, but the essence of an eternal questioning. The Jarl's journey was not merely a rebellion against a distant pantheon, but a profound exploration of the very core of power. He discovered in the depths of the fjords and the heights of the mountains that true strength lies not in blind submission or in the hope of outside intervention, but in the intrinsic capacity of each being to shape their own destiny. The gods, with their glories and their laws, became less the center of the universe and more a reflection of humanity's own self-imposed limitations. Ragnar taught us that autonomy is not a gift bestowed, but a hard-won achievement, forged in the furnace of courage and tempered by ancient wisdom that resides not in the golden halls of Asgard, but in the deep roots of the earth itself. He showed us that power emanates not only from the celestial, but from the earthly, the elemental, from the ceaseless cycle of life and death that pulses through every fiber of the cosmos. The audacity to stray from the beaten path, to question the established order, and to seek knowledge where it is scarcest, is the true act of honor. For honor, in the end, is not servitude, but the responsibility to protect and thrive, to use strength and intelligence to build a more resilient future, even if it means walking in the shadows where the light of the gods scarcely dares to reach. The Shadow Jarl Saga is a timeless reminder that destiny is not an immutable thread woven by the Norns, but a fabric in constant development, whose threads can be rewritten by a steady hand and a brave heart. It encourages us to look beyond appearances, to question the authorities that limit us, and to recognize the latent strength that resides within ourselves and the world around us. True practice begins now, not in temples or rituals of worship, but in the courage to embrace our own shadows, to unravel the energies that surround us, and to claim the power to be architects of our own path. The legend of Ragnar Völundar is an invitation to awaken the Jarl within each of us, ready to challenge what oppresses us and forge a legacy of self-reliance and unwavering strength.